In December 2010, police searching for one missing woman discovered 4 murdered women instead. What they had uncovered was no longer a missing person investigation. It was the dumping ground of a serial killer. One set of human remains, then another, and then a fourth. All 4 victims were women. All had been left within roughly a quarter mile of one another near Gilgo Beach. They would become known as the Gilgo Four. But the person responsible had left behind no obvious name, no clear face, and no immediate trail leading police to his door. For more than 12 years, investigators made no arrest and publicly identified no definitive suspect. Families waited for answers. Detectives pursued leads that went nowhere. Years passed. Then, on July 13, 2023, investigators arrested a man named Rex Heuermann. He was not hiding in another country. He was not living under a false identity. He was an architect who lived in Massapequa Park, less than 20 miles from Gilgo Beach. He traveled regularly to his office in Midtown Manhattan. He met clients, worked on construction projects, returned home to his family, and lived in the same Long Island community for most of his life. But behind that ordinary routine was a series of crimes that stretched from 1993 to 2010. In April 2026, Heuermann pleaded guilty to murdering 7 women and admitted killing an 8th. For decades, he had remained unidentified. So how did he avoid arrest for so long? Why were investigators unable to connect the cases earlier? What combination of an old witness statement, cell phone records, and discarded DNA finally exposed him? And what tiny mistake finally destroyed the carefully constructed life he believed would protect him forever? This is that story. Welcome to Real Crime Documentaries. Real cases, real people, real consequences. If you followed this case while it was unfolding, tell me in the comments when you first heard about it. And if you are new here, subscribe for more carefully researched true crime documentaries. Now let us begin. Rex Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963. He grew up in Massapequa Park, New York, a suburban community on the South Shore of Long Island. He later studied architecture at the New York Institute of Technology and built a career as an architectural consultant. Eventually, he operated his own firm in Manhattan. His work involved navigating New York City building codes, renovation requirements, and construction regulations. To the people who encountered him professionally, he was an architect and businessman. At home, he lived with his wife, Asa Ellerup, and their family in the Massapequa Park house where he had grown up. Nothing about that public life connected him to a series of unsolved killings across Long Island. But the first known victim in the case was found years before the name Gilgo Beach became associated with murder. Her name was Sandra Costilla. She was 28 years old. On November 20th, 1993, 2 hunters discovered her body in a wooded area of North Sea, a community in the Hamptons. The location was more than 60 miles from Gilgo Beach. At the time, investigators treated Sandra's death as an individual homicide. There was no Gilgo Beach task force. There was no known series of connected victims. And there was no evidence publicly pointing to Rex Heuermann. Sandra's case remained unsolved for more than 30 years. Heuermann would later admit that her death was the first of the 7 murders for which he was formally convicted. But in 1993, investigators did not know they were looking at the beginning of a much larger case. 3 years later, another woman disappeared. Her name was Vergata. Karen was 34 years old and the mother of 2 sons. On April 20th, 1996, partial remains belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered on Fire Island. Investigators could not determine who she was. For years, she was known only as Fire Island Jane Doe. More of her remains were discovered near Ocean Parkway in April 2011 as police expanded the Gilgo Beach search. But even then, her identity remained unknown. Advances in DNA analysis finally helped investigators identify her as Karen Vergata in 2022. Her sons had spent decades without knowing what had happened to their mother. Heuermann was never formally charged with Karen's murder. However, during his guilty plea in April 2026, he admitted that he killed her in 1996. At the time Karen's partial remains were first discovered, police had no reason to connect her case to Sandra Costilla. The victims had been found years apart. Their remains were discovered in different parts of Long Island. The investigations were handled separately. There was no visible pattern. But around the year 2000, another young woman disappeared. Her name was Valerie Mack. She was 24 years old. Valerie was last seen by her family in the spring or summer of 2000. In September of that year, partial skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area of Manorville, New York. Investigators could not identify her. More of her remains were found along Ocean Parkway in April 2011. For approximately 20 years, Valerie did not have a confirmed name in the investigation. Then, in 2020, forensic genealogy finally identified her. That identification gave investigators another victim's name, but it did not yet give them the identity of her killer. 3 years after Valerie disappeared, 20-year-old Jessica Taylor was killed. In July 2003, partial remains belonging to Jessica were discovered in a wooded area of Manorville. Additional remains belonging to her were later found along Ocean Parkway in March 2011. The separate locations raise an important question. Were the Manorville discoveries and the remains found near Gilgo Beach connected? Years would pass before investigators could fully understand how the cases fit together. By 2003, 4 women later linked to Heuermann had been killed. But police were still looking at separate crime scenes, separate timelines, and separate investigations. There was no public warning about one person moving between them, and there was no identified suspect connecting the cases. For several years, there were no additional known victims. Then, in July 2007, Maureen Brainard-Barnes traveled from her home in Norwich, Connecticut, to New York. Maureen was 25 years old and the mother of 2 children. On July 9th, she told a friend that she was leaving her Manhattan hotel to meet a client. She was never heard from again. Investigators later determined that her cell phone was last used on Long Island. But at the time, police did not know where she had gone or who she had met. Her children were left without an answer, and the person responsible remained unidentified. 2 years later, another woman disappeared. Melissa Barthelemy was 24 years old. She was last seen at her apartment in the Bronx on July 10, 2009. Melissa told a friend that she was going to meet someone and expected to return the following morning. She never came back. Cell phone data later indicated that her final known movements led toward Long Island. Then, days after Melissa disappeared, someone began using her cell phone to make disturbing calls to members of her family. The caller taunted them while concealing his identity. Investigators tried to trace the calls, but they had been made from busy areas around Manhattan. The caller was able to disappear among thousands of other cell phone users. Those calls showed that Melissa had likely encountered someone dangerous, but they still did not reveal who he was. In June 2010, 22-year-old Megan Waterman traveled from Maine to Long Island. She was last seen leaving a motel in Hauppauge during the early morning hours of June 6th. Megan left behind a young daughter. Investigators began searching for her, but there was no immediate connection to Maureen or Melissa. Then, on September 2nd, 2010, 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello disappeared from her home in West Babylon. Amber had arranged to meet a client. A man who knew her later told investigators that the person he believed was the client drove a Chevrolet Avalanche. At the time, that description did not lead to an arrest. But more than a decade later, it would become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Amber was the final known victim in the 17-year series of murders Heuermann later admitted. However, the discovery that connected 4 of the victims began with a different missing person investigation. On May 1st, 2010, 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert disappeared in Oak Beach, a gated community near Gilgo Beach. Shannon had visited a client's home. During the early morning hours, she called 911 and said she believed someone was pursuing her. She then fled the property, knocked on a neighbor's door, and ran into the surrounding marshland. Police searched for her for months. It is important to make one distinction clear. Rex Heuermann was never charged with causing Shannon Gilbert's death, and authorities did not include her among the 8 women he admitted killing. Her disappearance, however, triggered the search that exposed the wider Gilgo Beach case. On December 11, 2010, a Suffolk County police officer and his search dog were conducting an exercise along Ocean Parkway when they discovered human remains. Authorities initially wondered whether they had found Shannon. Instead, the victim was later identified as Melissa Barthelemy. 2 days later, on December 13th, police found 3 more bodies along the same quarter-mile stretch. They were Amber Lynn Costello, Megan Waterman, and Maureen Brainard-Barnes. The 4 women became known as the Gilgo Four. On December 14th, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer announced that investigators believed a serial killer might be responsible. The search expanded. In March 2011, police found additional remains belonging to Jessica Taylor. In April, they found additional remains belonging to Valerie Mack. They also discovered the remains of other people who were not included among the 8 murders Heuermann later admitted. On April 11, 2011, additional remains belonging to Karen Vergata were found several miles west of Gilgo Beach. The search had uncovered a much larger mystery than investigators first understood. Then, in December 2011, Shannon Gilbert's remains were found in a tidal marsh near Oak Beach. Authorities later said they believed she had accidentally drowned, although her family continued to question that conclusion. By that point, the Gilgo Beach investigation had become national news. Police had multiple victims. They had cell phone evidence. They had material recovered from the bodies. And they had the description of a Chevrolet Avalanche connected to Amber Costello's disappearance. But they still did not have a named suspect. The case remained unresolved for more than a decade. Then a new team went back through the evidence. In early 2022, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office created a new Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force. The group included local police, state police, sheriff's investigators, the FBI, and other law enforcement partners. The task force returned to the original witness statements and physical evidence. One detail stood out. A witness had reported seeing a Chevrolet Avalanche connected to the man Amber Costello went to meet on the night she disappeared. Investigators examined vehicle records. Their search led them to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche that had been registered to Rex Heuermann. He lived in Massapequa Park, close to where Amber had disappeared. He also matched the general physical description provided by a witness. For the first time, investigators had a specific person to examine. But a vehicle alone was not enough. They needed to determine whether his movements connected him to the victims. Investigators analyzed cell phone records linked to burner phones used to contact several women. They then compared those records with activity from Heuermann's personal phone. The phones repeatedly appeared in the same general areas at similar times. When a burner phone connected to a victim was active in Manhattan, Heuermann's personal phone was often nearby. When the burner phone traveled toward Long Island, records indicated that his personal phone followed a similar route. Investigators also connected fictitious email accounts and burner phone activity to locations associated with Heuermann. The pattern was difficult to dismiss, but the task force still needed physical evidence. That meant DNA. Investigators began following Heuermann without alerting him. In January 2023, surveillance officers watched him discard a pizza box in Manhattan. Inside were leftover crusts. The officers recovered the box and submitted the material for DNA testing. The DNA profile obtained from the discarded food was compared with a male hair that had been recovered from material associated with Megan Waterman's remains. According to prosecutors, the testing strongly supported that the hair came from Heuermann. Investigators now had the vehicle, the cell phone pattern, the burner phones, the physical description, and DNA evidence. After years without a publicly identified suspect, the investigation was moving rapidly. Authorities also feared that Heuermann might discover they were watching him. On July 13, 2023, police arrested Rex Heuermann near his Manhattan office. He was initially charged with murdering Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. Prosecutors also said he was the primary suspect in Maureen Brainard-Barnes' death. He pleaded not guilty, but the investigation was only beginning to reveal what had been hidden. Police searched Heuermann's house vehicles, office, and electronic devices. Investigators collected an enormous amount of material. They examined computers, phones, online accounts, documents, and physical evidence. In January 2024, Heuermann was charged with murdering Maureen Brainard-Barnes. Prosecutors said hair evidence and other findings strengthened the connection between him and Maureen. In May 2024, investigators returned to his Massapequa Park home for another extensive search. The following month, Heuermann was charged with murdering Sandra Costilla and Jessica Taylor. The new filing revealed one of the most significant pieces of post-arrest evidence. Investigators had recovered a deleted Microsoft Word document from one of Heuermann's electronic devices. Prosecutors described it as a planning document or blueprint. It contained notes about preparation, avoiding detection, controlling crime scenes, and disposing of evidence. The document did not identify the victims by name, but prosecutors argued that parts of it corresponded with details from the murders. Importantly, this document did not lead police to Heuermann before his arrest. It was recovered during the examination of devices seized afterward. In December 2024, prosecutors added another murder charge. This time, the victim was Valerie Mack. Heuermann was now formally charged with 7 murders spanning from 1993 to 2010. Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. For nearly 3 years after his arrest, Heuermann maintained his not guilty pleas. A trial was expected. The victims' families prepared for the possibility of hearing weeks or months of evidence. Then, in April 2026, the case took an unexpected turn. On April 8, 2026, Rex Heuermann appeared before Judge Timothy Motze in Suffolk County Court. He changed his pleas. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. Those 7 convictions covered the murders of Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. During his statement in court, he also admitted that he had killed Karen Vergata in 1996. He had never been formally charged in Karen's death. That meant Heuermann had now acknowledged killing 8 women over 17 years. As part of the plea proceedings, he admitted that he had targeted the women, killed them, and taken steps to conceal the crimes. The guilty pleas removed the need for a trial. But for the victims' families, they did not erase the decades of uncertainty. Some had waited more than 30 years. Some had raised children without their mothers. Some had spent years without even knowing where their loved ones had been taken. The legal question of guilt had finally been answered. The emotional consequences remained. On June 17, 2026, Heuermann returned to court for sentencing. Family members stood before the judge and described the effect the killings had had on their lives. They spoke about lost mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. They spoke about the years of waiting, the lack of answers, and the pain of knowing that Heuermann had continued living freely while their family suffered. When Heuermann was given an opportunity to speak, he accepted responsibility but offered few words. Judge Motze condemned him directly. The court then imposed the sentence. For the 3 first-degree murder convictions, Heuermann received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the 4 second-degree murder convictions, he received 4 additional consecutive terms of 25 years to life. In total, the sentence amounted to 3 consecutive life without parole terms, followed by another 100 years to life. He will never be released from prison. The sentence formally applied to the 7 murders for which he had been charged and convicted. Karen Vergata remained the 8th victim whose killing he admitted in court. Even after the convictions, the wider Gilgo Beach investigation did not simply disappear. Other remains had been discovered during the original searches. Some cases were later determined to be unrelated. Others continued to be investigated separately. One unidentified victim, historically referred to by investigators as Asian Doe, remained unnamed for years. The case demonstrated that one search can expose multiple crimes involving different offenders and different timelines. It also showed why precision matters. Shannon Gilbert's disappearance led police to the Gilgo 4, but Heuermann was never charged in her death. Other remains were discovered near Ocean Parkway, but not every victim found there was connected to Heuermann. The 8 women whose death he admitted were part of a specific series stretching from Sandra Costilla in 1993 to Amber Lynn Costello in 2010. The investigation was solved through several different breakthroughs. Forensic genealogy helped restore Valerie Mack's identity. An old witness statement about a Chevrolet Avalanche focused investigators on Heuermann. Cell phone records connected his movements to burner phones used to contact victims. Discarded DNA strengthened the case before his arrest. And digital forensics uncovered additional evidence afterward. No single clue solved everything. The vehicle did not prove the murders by itself. The phones did not prove the murders by themselves. The pizza crust did not tell the entire story. But together, those pieces created a pattern that investigators could follow. A pattern that had remained hidden for more than a decade. Behind every piece of evidence was a person. Sandra Costilla was 28 years old. Karen Vergata was 34 and the mother of 2 sons. Valerie Mack was 24. Jessica Taylor was 20. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was 25 and the mother of 2 children. Melissa Barthelemy was 24. Megan Waterman was 22 and the mother of a young daughter. Amber Lynn Costello was 27. 8 women, 8 lives. Families who waited years, some of them decades, for answers. For 33 years, the person responsible for Sandra Costilla's death remained unidentified. For more than 12 years after the Gilgo 4 were discovered, the investigation produced no arrest. Then detectives returned to an old description of a vehicle. They followed the phones. They waited for DNA. And the ordinary-looking life Rex Heuermann had built around himself finally collapsed. That is the Gilgo Beach case. A story about the limits of an investigation. The importance of returning to old evidence. And the persistence required to solve crimes long after the person responsible believes the danger has passed. Most importantly, it is the story of 8 women whose lives mattered long before their names became associated with a criminal case. Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. Their names should be remembered. Thank you for watching Real Crime Documentaries. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe for more carefully researched cases focused on the victims, the evidence, and the investigations. And leave a comment below. Which piece of evidence do you believe was most important? The vehicle, the cell phone records, or the discarded DNA? We will see you in the next documentary.